So welcome everybody to the World Transforms YouTube. Those that are listening through the YouTube page, please do subscribe. My name is Pablo Navarrete. I'm an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker. I'm here on behalf of TWT to chair this excellent panel today called Reporting on the Crimes of Empire, from WikiLeaks to Shireen Abu Akleh. And I'm delighted to have in the studio with us Stella Assange, Julian Assange's wife, John McAvoy, a British journalist, and we also have somewhere in the world, in Brazil, we have Brian Mayer, a US Brazilian-based journalist. So hopefully he is there, great. And we also have Vijay Prashad, who many of you will know. He's attended various TWT festivals in person, but I'm not sure where he is today. He's always in different parts of the world every time I check, but he is somewhere, and he is... So we have the four panelists. Unfortunately, Mariam Barghouti cannot join us due to last minute something came up. So Vijay has kindly adjusted his talk a little bit to talk about the case of Shireen Abu Akleh. So we will try and talk about as many issues related to this, to the title of this panel, Crimes of Empire. And by Crimes of Empire, this was a title that was given to me, but I take that to mean the crimes of the US government, essentially, especially in relation to WikiLeaks. But obviously, we have to talk about the US government's satellite states or proxies or allies, however you want to call it, and that includes obviously the UK government. And I thought it was important to discuss, given that we're in the UK, what the British government does, because this is something that doesn't really appear in the mainstream media. Generally, the mainstream media likes to concentrate on the crimes of our official enemies and not the ones that our governments do and their allies. So I'd like to start with John. John wasn't listed, but he's Liverpool-based, and I'm really happy he can join us last minute, and thank you for coming. John is the the best investigative journalist exposing and exploring UK foreign policy in Latin America, but he's also written a lot on the case of Julian Assange. We wrote a piece looking at the Guardian's reporting or misreporting, however you want to call it. We call it more misreporting. And John's going to, John's going to talk about the UK government, I guess, and the Assange case and some other issues. And then we'll be talking to Stella about the case of Julian's case and the developments, and also there is an event on the 8th that's really important that we want to urge everyone to attend. I'll be coming from Sheffield with my family, so we want as many people there as possible to surround Parliament, but maybe you can explain more about that. And then I'll invite Brian to talk about the case of Brazil. There's a very important elections taking place next weekend that could see the neo-fascist president Bolsonaro voted out of power, hopefully, and the return of Lula, the left-wing former president. And finally, we'll end on Vijay, and then we'll have a discussion. And we have, I think, just under an hour. So, John.
Great, thanks very much for that introduction. It's good to be here as well. As Pablo mentioned, I'd like to speak a little bit about my experience reporting on the crimes of British Empire, contemporary British imperialism, particularly in relation to Latin America. So as many people probably know, in 2019, Juan Guaidó, a relatively obscure, somewhat unknown Venezuelan opposition figure and a leader of the National Assembly, decided to declare himself president on the 23rd of January that year. The British government was one of the first, and under US pressure, to recognise Guaidó as the president of Venezuela, a farcical position, given only about 20% of Venezuelans, according to a certain poll, had even heard of Guaidó. And in the years that followed, Britain's involvement in the coup process in Venezuela was quite serious, and I've revealed a number of different stories on this issue. The first of which being that shortly after Britain recognised Guaidó, I found via the Freedom of Information Act that the Foreign Office had created a secret Venezuela Reconstruction Unit, a unit within the Foreign Office that was, as the title suggests, dedicated to the reconstruction, the economic, political, social reconstruction of Venezuela. I revealed this in 2020, and shortly afterwards, the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza, invited is a word, the British charge d'affaires, Duncan Hill, to basically explain the British government's position on this. Why had the Foreign Office created this unit dedicated to reconstructing another sovereign state? So this caused something of a diplomatic crisis, a diplomatic event at the very least. And the British media systematically ignored it. They ignored the original story. They ignored the Venezuelan government's response to this crime of British imperialism as well. And it's something that I've found figures generally in British media's coverage of British crimes abroad. As soon as Britain is implicated in imperialist crimes abroad, it simply ceases to exist. This is also the case with the frozen gold. Venezuela's frozen gold, roughly $2 billion worth of gold has been frozen in the Bank of England since 2019 as well. According to John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, this was also done under US pressure. It remains frozen in the Bank of England today. $2 billion is an incredibly significant amount of money. In 2018, the total value of medical and food imports to Venezuela was $2.3 billion, which gives you an idea of the amount of assets that have been frozen in Britain. Now, once again, this issue, which puts the British government in a totally farcical situation, in which foreign governments must now fear that if their relations are spoiled with the British government, then Britain can basically seize their assets, not only freeze them, and not only in the case of the US and Afghanistan, where it gave half of Afghanistan's assets to victims of 9/11. In fact, in Britain, what they're proposing to do is transfer it to Juan Guaido, the very figure who is actually leading coup attempts against the government. So they've seized Venezuela's sovereign state assets and are proposing to transfer them to an organisation that acts similarly to gangsters, and we're likely to see that then being used to fuel more coup attempts in Venezuela. It's similar with the case of the impact of sanctions. Studies have found that 40,000 Venezuelans died in about an 18-month period as a direct cause of sanctions, which include European and British sanctions, totally ignored. The UN Special Rapporteur on sanctions also urged the British government to return the gold to Venezuela so that it could buy medication in the context of the pandemic, also systematically ignored by the British media. The same happened with a colleague at Declassified UK, Matt Kennard, who wrote about British involvement in the coup in Bolivia, also in 2019 in November of that year. He found that Britain supported the coup in Bolivia, which overthrew Evo Morales, and instituted a kind of neo-fascist government under Janine Áñez. All with the interest of getting access to Bolivia's white gold, otherwise said lithium, once again systematically ignored by the British media. Now, the point I want to make with regards to Julian Assange here is that, as me and Matt have found, if you challenge the establishment, if you challenge the crimes of British imperialism, you get systematically ignored. But if you do something like what Julian Assange did, which was really challenge them, fundamentally challenge the structures of US and British imperialism, you don't only get ignored by the media, you get actively slandered, you get actively attacked across the British media, across the US media as well. Which brings us to an article that me and Pablo wrote about a year ago, based on The Guardian's reporting on Julian Assange, which has been absolutely horrific, especially given The Guardian won a number of prizes based on Assange's incredibly heroic work. And both articles basically tried to associate Assange with Russia and the Donald Trump campaign, and basically, by extension, blame Assange for what liberals saw as, the decline of US democracy. The first article was entitled Russia's Secret Plot to Help Julian Assange Escape from the UK. And it used anonymous sources to basically claim that in 2017 there was a secret plan to spirit Julian Assange away to Russia so that he could evade justice in the US based on the release of classified material. The Guardian has since had to walk back on this, but of course it didn't get nearly the attention that it did in the first place, and it was based on totally faulty material. Me and Pablo spoke with the lawyer that was representing Assange at the time, Aitor Martinez, who basically explained what actually happened, and it wasn't a Russian plot to spirit Assange out of the UK. It was actually a plan, a totally legal plan to offer Assange diplomatic immunity so that he could be transferred to a third country that would not extradite him to the US, where he faced torture and potentially, potentially could be killed for his journalism. And of course, we now find out that the CIA had active plans to murder him while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Now, the other article that The Guardian published about Assange was entitled Paul Manafort held secret talks with Assange in Ecuadorian embassy. Now, this has been basically as disproved as an article can get. The Guardian was forced to add sources say to this article because it became immediately clear that they couldn't substantiate their reporting with any facts. And this is just such a shameful case of British journalism just going to the dogs. This is effectively a fake news article that remains on the Guardian's website that they haven't been able to substantiate. And it gets even worse because now we find out, me and Pablo, that one of the Guardian's journalists was aware that the company that was supposed to be protecting Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, called UC Global, was in fact spying on him. And one of the Guardian journalists at the time was asking for the transcripts of Assange's private conversations with the Ecuadorian head of intelligence called Rami Vallejo. And so they were aware that, the UC Global was going far beyond its normal security and protecting Assange. It was actually spying on him. This wasn't reported. So you can tell what questions the Guardian was asking, and that they really had a bit of a vendetta against Assange, and basically scrapped all normal journalistic practices in its campaign to destroy him. And the effect that this media campaign has been to remove journalistic and liberal and society writ large solidarity with Assange in such an important case, which what we're looking at is the destruction of press freedom at a level that's really unprecedented. So that's my contribution.
Thanks a lot, John. And I think it's so shocking. The more I see, there's a book there, The Trial of Julian Assange. Maybe Stella will refer to it, but I mean that book is it's a really shocking expose by a former UN rapporteur on torture. And yeah, it's not only journalists, but I think everyone who cares about democracy should look into this case and do whatever they can to ensure that the British government does not extradite Julian Assange, because the precedents already set for press freedom and journalism are terrifying and chilling. So thanks a lot, John. You referenced Declassified. I forgot to say that you write for many media outlets, but primarily perhaps for Declassified at the moment, as well as doing your PhD on UK foreign policy in Colombia. Declassified UK, for those that don't know, is a relatively new website that's about 2 years old, that came about, that was created by Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis, an excellent UK academic journalist that's been looking into UK foreign policy for many years. And in a way, it comes out of a need for reporting on the UK security state, proper reporting, because of the changes at places like The Guardian that no longer now do any real security state reporting. So I would definitely urge you to check Declassified UK. And more broadly, I'd urge you to look into independent media. We have independent media. I'm a co-editor and founder of Alborada, an independent website that looks at Latin America, politics, media and culture in English. And I created that because of what I felt was the inadequacies of mainstream coverage of Latin America. So thank you very much. I'm going to move now to Stella. So Stella is, as I said, Julian Assange's wife, but she grew up in, here I've got your bio, so I'm just going to let the audience know, just in case. So you grew up in Southern Africa, you moved to Sweden, Spain, and then you now live in the UK with your 2 children. and you studied politics and law at SOAS and at Oxford, and you met Julian in 2011 when you joined his international legal team. So you said you're here with your 2 children, and you married Julian in March 2002 at Belmarsh High Security Prison. And for anyone that's been there, it's a very deeply oppressive place. Even the journey from London to get there on the train in the South London is oppressive, and yeah, but they have, I made a documentary 2 years ago about some of the supporters that gather there outside the prison and elsewhere to campaign, including my mum, actually, who's a former political prisoner, a Chilean refugee, a former political prisoner, and who has taken this case of Julian very much to her heart, because she, like many Latin Americans, understood perhaps from the very beginning that things weren't right here in terms of much of the developments that were taking place in Sweden. And as someone who's been on the sharp end of US-sponsored torture and oppression, she knows how the US government, what the extent to which they will go for someone who challenges their interests or exposes their criminality. So anyway, I'll leave Stella tell us more about the case and tell us about what's going on and what the next steps are.
Well, in terms of Julian's potential extradition, Priti Patel signed off on allowing the extradition in June. We're now challenging that before the High Court. We've submitted our arguments, but the High Court has no obligation to take the appeal. So we're in that process. There's no appeal date hearing, and there's no guarantee, actually, that the High Court will hear an appeal. So the situation is extremely serious. Julian has been in Belmarsh prison for 3.5 years now. He was arrested on the 11th of April 2019, and he's been in Britain's harshest prison ever since. He's not serving a sentence. He is there only because the United States is trying to prosecute him for publishing their crimes, including their war crimes, the highest possible crimes that exist in the international legal order. The charges relating to this prosecution concern the publications of 2010 and 2011, which came from an army source, Chelsea Manning, who was stationed in Iraq at the time and who was an intelligence analyst and was reading all these reports coming in from the battlefield and became a whistleblower and felt it was her duty to blow the whistle. And it was through the publications of WikiLeaks about Iraq and Afghanistan, the State Department cables about the prison in Guantanamo Bay, through which we learned the true, really the anatomy of the war on terror. You'll remember back in 2010 when these publications came out, these were they laid bare the reality of the war in a way that hadn't been done for a long time. During the Vietnam War, there were embedded journalists. But there was, raw reporting from the field, and then the U.S. military learnt its lesson, and then found a way to embed journalists and only kind of co-opt the journalists that went to Iraq. So we had a completely distorted understanding of what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was only through WikiLeaks that we got the raw data of deaths, of civilian casualties, 15,000 civilian casualties that had not appeared in any data, any account were revealed through WikiLeaks. 15,000. That's very easily said, but just picture the amount of corpses that is, men, women, children, grandparents, and so on. Innocent people. And this is what WikiLeaks published, and this is what Julian is being prosecuted for. And the U.S. has deployed a piece of legislation from 1917 in the middle of the First World War. They passed this act, which was immediately deployed to imprison critics of the U.S. effort in the First World War. And in fact, it was used against Eugene Debs, who was the head of the Communist Party at the time. And then for 100 years it was never used. In fact, it has never been used against a publisher until it was used against Julian. And during the Obama administration, Barack Obama, his Justice Department, in fact, announced that it was not going to be, Julian was not going to face any charges in relation to the Manning publications, because the only way to prosecute Julian would be, in order to do so, they would have to mount a case against journalism, and they weren't prepared to do that. So what changed? Nothing changed. The only thing that changed was who went into the White House. And the Trump administration was prepared to take a case that criminalized journalism, essentially, and did. And so the charges against Julian in relation to the Manning leaks came in 2018. And it is, in the United States, it has long been a source of anxiety for constitutional lawyers and for the press that one day the Espionage Act would be used against journalists. And it has now. So that moment has come to pass. This is a political case from beginning to end. Julian is being prosecuted explicitly for publishing true information about crimes committed by the US government. The UK government has approved sending Julian to the country who he exposed, but not just that. The US government, as John was mentioning before, since Julian's arrest, we've learned a lot of detail about the criminality in which, with which the US was conducting itself while Julian was inside the embassy. And it's not just a case, we're talking about here not just exposing the crimes of empire, but Julian's case has exposed state-sponsored attacks on the press, on a journalist like Julian. And Julian is such a high-profile case that this, doing so by engaging in criminality against the founder of WikiLeaks, the editor of WikiLeaks, a publication that has won dozens of journalism and human rights prizes of the highest caliber, it sets a new international standard. So we're now in an age of total impunity. This is what we're talking about today, you know, of attacks on journalists, including high-profile journalists like Khashoggi, like Shireen Abu Akleh, and like Julian Assange. And this is a we've now entered a new paradigm, and it's not just, you know, if they can go after such high-profile people, they can go after anyone. And this is not just the United States. Any country feels licensed, and in fact is I don't know, empowered to do so. So it's a very dangerous moment, and with Julian, it's just simply incomprehensible that the UK is still going along with it. Like you're saying, John, with all these, with the Venezuelan gold and so on, it undermines the UK's standing. I mean, who will put their $2 billion in the Bank of England now? They're going to go elsewhere, and in the long run, this is really going to marginalize the UK as just an appendage of the US. The UK has gone along with, so far, allowing the extradition of a journalist to the country that plotted his assassination, and this is just it loses all its credibility as a country of rule of law, or whatever you want to call it. The UK's international standing, its standing as a defender of press freedom, of a country that ensures the protection of journalists, all that is out the window now.
And before I move on to other speakers, I think it's important to discuss what can people do, people that are tuning in the UK, but anywhere in the world. But let's talk about the UK. I mean, I know there's an event on the 8th of October in London outside Parliament. What can people do? Attend that, but what else can they do? Because this is a political case. I think it's clear that this is not a normal extradition. This is a case where the UK is colluding with the US government to criminalise and to silence the journalists that expose their war crimes. And so, given that it's a political case, what kind of pressure can be brought on the UK political class to maybe change, to not carry out this horrific extradition?
Well, because it's a political case, it all depends on perception. And, I'd say for people have to stop to not be just spectators of this enormous injustice. We don't just see history and our contemporary history play out before our eyes. We're actually agents in our moment in time, the little time we have on this planet. We actually shape, and we also shape by not doing anything. You sit at home, you're also shaping the world that you're in. So on the 8th of October, we're going to surround Parliament with a human chain. I was really surprised actually to find out that it's never been done before. There has never been a human chain around the British Parliament. This was a real surprise to me, and I think it's a shame, and there should be more of that. And so the first time, I think, is very fitting, will be a show of solidarity to demand Julian to be free now. And this is a loud and clear message. And you have, for example, you had the president of Mexico 1 or 2 weeks ago on the day. This is a very important world leader. On the day of Mexico's independence, as he spoke to the people of Mexico, he brought Julian's case up, and he said this is the most important case for press freedom and for democracy. And everyone, everywhere, including in this country, especially in this country, I'd say, apart from the US, the most direct impact of this case as a precedent-setting case is in the UK. Because if they can do it to Julian, then no one is safe here from extradition to a third country. Julian is not American. The only thing he did was expose US crimes. And now they're going to pluck him out of the UK and take him to serve 175 years in the United States. This is intolerable. And I ask everyone to join me and thousands of other people. We're going to surround Parliament. We're going to cross the Bridge of Westminster. And it's going to be a fantastic day to be able to tell people, your family and friends about 30 years from now. It's also hugely significant for Julian because his life depends on not being extradited.
Okay, so if you're in London, and even if you're not in London, come on the 8th of October. I think the details are on the don'textraditeassange.com.
Yeah, you can sign up on don'textraditeassange.com, and there will be information. You sign up, we'll send you information. 8th of October, it's a Saturday, 1 p.m.
Okay. And I think you can also, on the Take Action section of that website, there's forms to write to your MP and to put political pressure if in the case that, you can do that in addition to attending, but if you can't attend, you should definitely contact your MP and demand that Julian is not extradited to the US. Thanks, Stella. We're going to move to Brian now, who's been waiting patiently there in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hi, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So as I said earlier, Brian is a US journalist, but lived in Brazil for many, many years, I believe. And he's a real expert on Brazilian politics. He's a co-editor of Brazil Wire, an excellent independent media outlet, and also a correspondent for Telesur, a pan-Latin American channel, Telesur English. So thanks a lot for joining us. I know you're extremely busy because with the elections on Sunday. So thanks for joining us. I know you're going to talk about Brazil, but also the connections to the UK government and yeah, I'll leave it with you, Brian. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I was initially planning on talking specifically about press freedom in Brazil, about the attacks against journalists going on. But, there's involvement of the UK government and the US government, obviously, in creating this situation in which journalists are so vulnerable right now. It's not a matter of argument or dispute or anything like that. It's a firmly established fact that the Operation Car Wash, or Lava Jato, as it's called in Portuguese, was a joint United States Department of Justice and Brazilian public prosecutors operation with partnership from the Swiss Federal Police as well and the SEC. And when a group of progressive members of Congress made an inquiry into the DOJ's involvement in, among other things, Lula's political imprisonment, in its response, it said, we've been talking about our partnership on our own webpage since 2016, and gave a bunch of links. I mean, you can read about this on their own website, right? And now that it's come out that the entire time, thanks to the leaks by Walter Delgatti, the hacker, who's now facing 300 consecutive one-year jail sentences because the Intercept didn't protect him well enough, I guess, and for whatever reasons. Because of that, we also know that during the entire 5-year period between the immediate lead up to the 2016 coup and after Lula had been even arrested up to the elections, every 15 days, a group of 17 FBI agents led by Leslie Bakshi's met with the Lava Jato prosecution team. So to coach them through things like how to selectively leak things to the media to help your case and stuff like that. So it's established. And then as regards to British involvement, thanks to John McAvoy and my partner from Brazil Wire, Dan, and Natalia Urban has done a little work on this. We also know that there were meetings between high-ranking government officials from the UK government and the Bolsonaro family long before they ever, before Bolsonaro was ever elected president, to talk about things like trade. And there's a lot of work that has to be done declassifying more information about these meetings and whatnot. And then also you look, getting back to the subject of the media, if you view the media as Gramsci did, as part of the extended state that serves the purpose of upholding the bourgeois project, then the media was a key actor in normalization of the frivolous charges against Lula, normalization of the illegitimate impeachment against Dilma Rousseff, who the crime that she allegedly committed, fiscal peddling, was legalized by the Senate 2 days after she left office, because everyone did it. All the mayors, all the governors, every president since the dictatorship did it in Brazil. Bolsonaro's doing it right now. But above and beyond that, last week the Supreme Court ruled that she didn't even do that. She wasn't even guilty of the infraction that was legalized after she left office, that was used as a justification for throwing her out, okay? But I wanted to get into the question of threats and violence against the media in Brazil and how they've increased dramatically since Bolsonaro took power. Most people know, the best example of this is the assassination of Don Phillips, who did a lot of writing for The Guardian and The Washington Post. But also, as recently as last week, there was an attack against a woman journalist, Vera Magalhães, by a state member of São Paulo State Congress, taking the lead from Bolsonaro, who accused her in a very machista way during the debates of being in love with him, being obsessed with him, and calling her a disgrace to journalism. So basically, what's happened is, over the course of several years, the bourgeois media, Brazil doesn't have very good libel law. The penalties for libel are extremely low. They're symbolic, $2,000, $3,000 in reais, 15,000 for libeling someone. And this led to a climate in which the Brazilian media was able to misrepresent for years these false accusations against Lula and the Workers' Party and other Workers' Party's officials and whatnot. And this bled into or was, deliberately done by the international media. So we have cases where newspapers like The Guardian, for example, repeated on multiple occasions the lie that Lula's conviction was connected to a 44 million real bribery case with Petrobras. They even published this 3 days before Lula was arrested. During the year he was arrested, this appeared in several Guardian articles. What it really was a charge that was removed from the case in 2016, 1 week after the trial was forum shopped out of its legal jurisdiction in Sao Paulo to the friendly court of US Department of Justice operative Sergio Moro, who ended up in a cabinet ministry position in the Bolsonaro government for his work removing Lula from the 2018 elections. So what Valesca Martins, who is Lula's defense lawyer, has said over and over again is that the international press repeatedly refused to go to any press conference from the defense for years. All they did was repeated accusations from the prosecutors, who we all know now were working illegally colluding with the judge, talking on WhatsApp, on Telegram, that they knew Lula was innocent the whole time. So instead of actually trying to triangulate information and whatnot, you have a situation where even now, in the BBC 3-part documentary about Bolsonaro, which was released like 2 weeks ago, they just repeat accusations from the prosecution against Lula. If someone says Lula was accused of receiving 1 million euros in bribes, that wasn't even included in the case against Lula that resulted in his imprisonment. Let alone mention that, he's been declared innocent of 26 frivolous charges, So I bring that up, not just because of the European and American journalists repeating these kinds of lies from the Lava Jato operation, but because the Brazilian media spent years just repeating this disinformation from the prosecution team. Because ironically, since Bolsonaro has taken power, most of the big attacks against journalists in Brazil have been against journalists who work for these mainstream media outlets that actually collaborated in putting him into power, either directly or indirectly, by misrepresenting the charges against Lula for years. So leftist or progressive journalists like myself, I've received threats. I have friends who receive threats on the internet and things like that. But the biggest actions have been against journalists who work for things like, for media like Globo, which was founded by Time Warner, and then during the military dictatorship to help increase social control over the population, for Folha do São Paulo, which supported the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, and for other of these mainstream media outlets. So basically, this fascist monster that has now gone out of control in Brazil, especially in concern of, related to the persecution of journalists, has turned back against some of the institutions that collaborated in putting it into power. And this reminds me of a Brazilian expression: you can raise a crow and it will still pluck your eyes out. This doesn't mean that I or anyone else approves of violence against journalists. All I'm saying is that it would be useful for these mainstream media companies to engage in some kind of self-criticism on how they contributed to this problem right now, where we have such serious issues as the assassination of Dom Phillips, which was normalized, by Bolsonaro's encouraging of harassments and violence against journalists. I'll give 3 quick cases. I'll give one more case. I've talked about Vera Magalhães. Patricia Campos Melo is a journalist from Folha do São Paulo. In 2018, shortly after the first round presidential election, she uncovered massive information, an incredible investigative piece of work, uncovering illegal use of the WhatsApp application, using big data, Cambridge Analytica style tactics to target certain segments of the electorate with lies and slander about the Workers' Party and about Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad. Everyone knew these rumors were being spread around on WhatsApp, but what she uncovered was illegal financing by the business community for this. After she released this story, the president of Brazil suggested that she had traded this information with sex for an Afro-Brazilian man. All right. So when Bolsonaro does this kind of thing, it's not that the Brazilian law persecutes journalism or journalists. It's that the actions of this neo-fascist president encourages millions of followers to harass journalists. And so after he said this, after he gave the green light, she was bombarded with death threats, rape threats, slander, flooding attacks on her social media accounts. And we've seen this happen over and over again against mainstream journalists in Brazil who try to criticize Bolsonaro, who actually do serious investigative work, uncovering corruption scandals, uncovering the relationship between his family and the death of Marielle Franco, and things like that. And so what does that mean? The elections are coming up this Sunday. These are the most important elections in Brazil since the end of the military dictatorship. Lula is leading by double digits in all the polls. Bolsonaro spent the last year announcing in advance that he won't recognize the results of the election if he loses. Their allies on the military who are announcing that they're going to do the same, that they won't recognize the results. But an internal poll conducted by the Defense Department shows that the Army is not on board with this. The Navy and Air Force Command would support Bolsonaro if he tried to hold an auto coup next week after the results of the election come out. But the Army, which is over 2 times the size of both of those branches of the armed forces, would not. Also, the military police, which has like 26 different organizations, each one runs at the state level, most of them are not on board. There's a growing international pressure against any kind of auto coup. It looks like, I've got my fingers crossed here, but it looks like it's not going to happen. But let's say Lula gets elected, which I hope he does, takes power in January. It's not going to end this current climate of fascist behavior against journalists in Brazil. Undoing this kind of Bolsonarista mentality of treating journalists as internal enemies, is going to take a lot of work, a lot of kind of like, I don't know, political education work and things like that, even in schools and in society at large, because I guess you could say the genie of fascism against journalists has been let out of the bottle by Bolsonaro. It's not just going to automatically pop back in there. So
thank you so much, Brian, for that update about cases that we rarely hear about, certainly in the UK media, and I'd say in the English language mainstream media. You touched upon that issue of the fake news by the right, because there's often this kind of theory or speculation that the social media and all of that will benefit the left and the alternative voices, but there is this whole use of this technology by the right that has been pivotal in places like Brazil, and now we're getting big tech criminalizing independent left-wing media in collusion with the US government. And so perhaps I think maybe Vijay will touch on these issues, and Vijay, who's been patiently waiting, is kindly going to also, I think I asked him if he could touch on the case of Shireen Abu Akleh a little bit as well. As I said earlier, Mariam Barghouti unfortunately couldn't join us. So, as I said earlier, Vijay, he's the director of the Tricontinental Institute, chief editor of Left Word Books, a prolific journalist. Every time I check, he's got a new book out. A prolific writer. He's always in different parts of the world, exposing the actions of the US empire, and he's a very eloquent voice for kind of a new politics that we need. So welcome, Vijay. I'm delighted that you can join us.
Thanks a lot, Pablo. Nice to be with you, Brian, Stella, John. Great to be with you. I just want to hold up that book by Niels Melzer you have on the table. It's a terrific book, The Trial of Julian Assange. If you read one thing about Julian Assange, I recommend this book. Niels has the benefit of of knowing Swedish. So he goes and spends a lot of time, in the records of the Swedish police and so on, demonstrating how the case against Julian Assange essentially was manufactured. It's a very interesting account from somebody, a high official of the United Nations. Pablo said, will you say something about Shireen Abu Akleh? What can I say? I knew her in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, a terrific journalist, 51 years old, went to cover some gunfighting in Jenin, was shot to death, working for Al Jazeera with a big sign in front of her that said press. The Israeli government immediately said that, well, she was killed by Palestinians. Then there was some softening of their position, perhaps crossfire and so on. When Shireen was buried in Jerusalem, it was one of the largest funerals that Jerusalem, indeed occupied Palestine, has seen in 25 years. At that funeral, the Israeli police essentially went crazy, beating people. The coffin almost fell to the ground. Really horrendous behavior. Some of that was covered in the media. And the point is that Israel eventually had to acknowledge that she was shot by an Israeli bullet, but there will be no justice for Shireen Abu Akleh. The United States government has essentially said, well, we'll leave it to Israel. And there it is, a journalist, a wonderful person, age 51, murdered, assassinated by the Israelis while covering a story in Jenin. There will be no justice for her. A case closed, I'm afraid. Her picture will come up as murals across not only the West Bank and Gaza and perhaps other parts of the Palestinian diaspora, perhaps in other countries out of solidarity, the name Shireen Abu Akleh will be remembered. But let me tell you something, we live in an extremely ugly world. There will be no justice for her. The Zionist regime is simply not going to allow the acknowledgement that they assassinated a working journalist. And here's the scandal. Shireen Abu Akleh is a US citizen. A US citizen was killed while doing her work as a reporter, and the US government doesn't care. Why is this a surprise to anybody? The US government killed a 16-year-old boy in Yemen, a 16-year-old boy who was a US citizen. He had no relation to Al-Qaeda or anything. His father had been previously assassinated by the United States, but why did they go and kill a 16-year-old boy, a US citizen? An assassination without any trial, without any accusation, and so on. If that is possible, if the killing of a young boy is possible, a journalist gets killed. That's the world we're living in. All this talk about human rights and journalist freedom and so on, be careful about believing any of that stuff. These people certainly don't. These ugly, ugly people with a lot of power at their fingertips simply don't believe it. They don't honor it at all in real life. And here's the evidence. I want to just make a couple of points. The first is I highly recommend a new article by Serge Halimi and Pierre Rimbert in the recent issue of Le Monde Diplomatique. You can read it in French, you can read it in English. An excellent piece where they talk about, they have a phrase which I want to share with you called true but unwelcome news. True but unwelcome news. I read that article, I read that phrase, and it really resonated with me. We are trying our best to put forward as journalists the facts of a situation, but it turns out that some of the narratives, the stories, the facts that we're putting on the table are unwelcome. Well, who are they unwelcome to? They are unwelcome to people who would authorize the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh or would allow a drone assassination program to go on even till this day. They find this news unwelcome. So what do they do when you produce true but unwelcome news? They disparage you. I mean, either you're in prison or other things happen. I was actually really surprised, and I very much hope people in the UK will read the leaked emails from Paul Mason, where this former journalist is in communication with British intelligence. And essentially what they start talking about is how they must characterize dissent as disinformation. It's a kind of black ops conversation that Paul Mason has with British intelligence. Striking to me. I mean, I know Paul Mason. I've talked to him many times. of course, I'm part of that email in the sense that he says, I'm one of the people whose writings must be now characterized not as dissent, but as disinformation. And this is an interesting phenomena. It's not restricted to somebody like him. You know this from the way in which the attacks come, this whole concept of whataboutism. I'll give you a quick history of that term. That term comes to disparage the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, when the British were bombing people's homes and places where civilians gathered in Derry, in Belfast, in other parts of the northern counties of Ireland. The IRA retaliated by attacking a pub in London. At the time, the IRA said, look, we're only doing this because you're hitting our civilians. And, you got this term appear in British newspapers. Oh, this is whataboutism. Instead of dealing with the fact that you've killed civilians in England, you want to say, what about something else? This is a term that has now returned. Anytime you want to talk about Iraq, for instance, or you want to talk about Yemen or Libya, people say, well, that's whataboutism. What you got to talk about is the crimes of Russia. Don't bring anything else in. It's a very interesting way to characterize dissent as what they call disinformation. Terms like tanky bandied about, to make people just look like they're not serious journalists or not serious writers or thinkers or whatever it is. Smear campaigns are legion. To basically take people out. You don't actually have to always assassinate a journalist. You don't even have to come out and argue with their ideas. You just make their reputations doubtful. That's exactly what they initially did with Julian Assange. You go after their reputations. You talk about something else. You don't deal with what they're talking about directly. You come around the thing and smear their reputation. It's not a new thing. This has been happening for centuries. But now the technology has made it very easy to get rid of people's reputations just like this. Very dangerous situation. And I want people to think about this. Reflect on that term from Serge Halimi and Pierre Rimbert, which is people are putting out true but unwelcome news. Unwelcome to whom? And why is this unwelcome? And what do they do when unwelcome news is put out there? Well, it's not just unwelcome news. It's not just the content of what we're putting out there, it's the form as well. You see, they don't want any context. They don't want any history. You can't talk about Ukraine in its longer history. You have to talk about Ukraine from the 23rd, 24th of February of this year. Anything before that, that's not allowed. You got to just stay in the moment. Do you condemn this? Do you not condemn this? What about trying to understand what's happening? Whether I condemn something or don't condemn it is not relevant. I'm trying to understand a long process. You can't understand what's happening in Puerto Rico now, where the hurricane has clobbered the island, unless you look at the context, you look at the way the island's financings in a colonial situation has been undermined, that they don't have the means to create a proper electricity grid and so on. Can't understand what's happening there unless you have the context, but they don't want context. So not only is it the content, we don't like what you're saying, unwelcome facts, but we also don't like the form in which you're saying things. The context, we don't want context. We just want to yell at you and say, do you agree with this? Do you not agree with this? By the way, Brian, I don't know if you agree with me, but Bolsonaro is the master of this. He says something in place X to some right-wing journal. He'll say that homosexuals should be killed. Then the mainstream will ask him, did you say that about homosexuals? Say, I never said that. That's fake news. Why are you bringing that up? Ask me a question now. I mean, he's a master of breaking context, saying different things, a complete insincere kind of politics. And we on the left are trapped because all we can say is, look, here's what he said here and here's what he said here. So he's lying. By the time you do that, the story is already out there and over. He's accomplished his task. Mobilize the right wing, get them all angry, and then confuse the voters at the center. He doesn't care about the left saying, oh, you're a hypocrite. The argument from hypocrisy never works. So we are, in that sense, formally also at a great disadvantage. But in closing, I want to say this, friends. This is not working around the world. People in different parts of the world are no longer interested in this. And, when I travel in countries on the African continent in particular, there's a kind of new awakening. People are just not interested at being lectured at by The Guardian, by CNN, and so on. They don't believe them anymore. They're fed up with the kind of reporting that takes place in Western news outlets. But unfortunately, the alternatives are few, and that's part of the problem. The alternatives are very few. And this is one of the reasons why the West has gone to such lengths to disparage news outlets from, say, Russia, China, even the Middle East, to insist that YouTube carries a disclaimer that these are state-sponsored outlets. BBC is effectively a state-sponsored outlet. Fox News effectively takes instructions from the U.S. State Department, but it doesn't appear with a disclaimer that these are state-sponsored outlets. They're worried about alternatives. They don't want alternatives to emerge, but people are not buying it anymore. The problem, I would say, is that there are no alternatives. And anytime any alternative appears, it gets disparaged. The smear campaign starts. Dissent or a different view is characterized as disinformation. This is a tough time to be in the media, honestly. It's hard to produce true but unwelcome facts. It's a tough time. I don't have any answers. I struggle with this right now as a reporter. How do I put forward true but unwelcome facts and not get characterized as a purveyor of disinformation? I struggle a lot with this. And I hope you will struggle as well. And I hope we find an exit.
Thank you, Vijay. Yeah, I'm sure lots of us struggle with getting some stories out that challenge these mainstream narratives. I've been told we've got an extra, we've just got under 10 minutes. And I just kind of wanted to pick up on the issue of, we are here sitting in Toxdeath TV, an independent TV channel, I believe in Liverpool. And I think this issue of independent media, I think given that I would say we all agree that the mainstream media is not fit for purpose in many ways. Although I think maybe Stella, I'd like to maybe come to you and just on the issue of the mainstream media. And I think there's been a bit of a change in terms of the reporting on Julian, at least in terms of The Guardian, perhaps, and other press freedom groups that perhaps before weren't on board. I think there is now a critical mass of journalistic outlets who are in opposition to the extradition of Julian Assange. So that's a welcome change. Could you just tell us a little bit first about that? Would you say that, and how useful that is for the prospects of freeing Julian?
Well, it's essential that these mainstream channels recognize the significance, the danger that this case poses generally for them, and I think they've come very late to the party to actually understand what in a sense they've been enabling for many years, and now perhaps because their legal departments have actually sat down and looked at this, and quite a few there hasn't been the level of reporting that there should have been. I mean, you just compare Julian's case to, for example, the case of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard in The Guardian. If you take The Guardian just as an example, I'd very much like The Guardian to match their coverage of Johnny Depp, Amber Heard's libel case, match that with Julian's extradition appeal hearing, and have the same amount of articles. That's certainly my expectation, but I'll wait and see if I'm disappointed. But in terms of their editorial position, yes, The Guardian, even The Telegraph, the Mail on Sunday, and in the United States, The Washington Post, USA Today, the New York Times, they're all editorially, institutionally, completely opposed to this prosecution and calling for Julian's freedom. And the same goes for virtually every press freedom group and human rights group that you can name: Amnesty International, RSF, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Human Rights Watch, and so on. In their dozens, they've come out and said that Julian has to be freed, that this prosecution is an attack on press freedom itself. but more needs to be done, because the fact is, when the polling shows that the average person just doesn't know the case. They don't understand the significance. Some of them don't even know that Julian's been in prison in London for 3.5 years for publishing true information about war crimes. They don't even know that he's left the embassy. And whose fault is that? That's no one's fault but the press. They have a duty. And if people aren't informed, it's because they're not doing their job. And especially in a case like this, where the consequences of this case, the outcome of this case, will shape the new reality of basically the contours of press freedom in this country, in this very country, when it comes to reporting about the gravest crimes, about state actors, state officials committing crimes, about cover-ups, about torture. It's been criminalized, and as long as Julian remains in prison, press freedom has no chance. There is no possibility of something that we can call press freedom, and this has also a knock-on effect on freedom of speech more generally. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than Vijay, I think, on the media climate. I mean, I think there's a proliferation, and you guys are expressions of that, of alternative places to get information. If you compare it to 5 years ago or whatever, and WikiLeaks is an archive of millions of documents, that's not going to go away. And in fact, newsrooms use WikiLeaks material all the time. They don't necessarily say it, but there are investigations about the killing of Pakistan's former prime minister, and all the time, you see, even on the BBC, they're sourcing from WikiLeaks constantly. So that's not going away. So the mainstream media, there's a lot to criticize there, but I don't think many people are paying attention. And like for the BBC, you look at the viewership and it's aging, and people go elsewhere. And I think there's a lot of that is at least hopeful. And people are also getting better educated because they see they are critical of the mainstream.
Yeah, I think I think certain developments, for example, in the UK, I think the vilification of Corbyn by the mainstream, but particularly the so-called left or progressive liberal section of was certainly provided, I think, an eye-opener for lots of people around the perhaps what I'd argue is the true role of the mainstream media. We don't have much time, but maybe can I just bring in Brian and John, given that you also both work for independent media outlets, Declassified, Brazil Wire. I mean, if you could, in as short a way as possible, tell us how hopeful are you about independent media as a means to challenge this? I mean, what can we do? What can the independent media realistically achieve, or given that is the mainstream reformable in any way? John, big questions.
Well, I mean, the whole point of creating and contributing to these independent media organisations is based on the premise that the corporate media is more or less unreformable. I mean, if you take any structural analysis of the media, it contends that it is what it is. It is unreformable, and in many senses, it's actually getting worse. It's going beyond, Chomsky's analysis in manufacturing consent, and we're jumping to the basic oligarchization of the media with Jeff Bezos and many others, basically just taking over, such as the Washington Post. And every other week there's an article in the Washington Post that says, in defense of billionaires or something absolutely ridiculous like that. So we're actually going further than what we had before with structural analysis of the media and the filters of control. But yeah, I mean, it is a hopeful time with regards to independent media, and I think Declassified, especially Matt and Mark, have published a number of articles on the Julian Assange case, which in my opinion, and in many other people's opinion, should have been sufficient to actually get the case thrown out. So we have the information, we have people that are contributing in incredibly important ways, and it's just a case of making sure that we elevate independent media so that it can have the sufficient impact to actually have an impact on cases like Assange and others as well.
Thanks, John. Brian, can I bring you in on the same question, I guess, or any last comments you'd like to make?
Yeah. First of all, one quick last comment. The Workers' Party has an enormous amount of solidarity for Julian Assange on all levels of the party, from Lula down, from the people up. Okay. Regarding independent media, I'm a little bit more pessimistic. You know, I've been involved in it now for like 30 years, and what I see is that it depends way too much on companies owned by right-wing tech billionaires, for starters, that manipulate algorithms. So some of the best independent media organizations out there just get shadow banned and buried. And also there's fake independent media. The US and UK governments are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in these kinds of like fake, they look like independent media, but they're not. And then there's independent media that starts off, develops a good reputation, and all of a sudden they're like rabidly supporting the truckers' strike in Canada, the truck company owners' strike in Canada. All of a sudden they've gone super like anti-vax or something like that in a climate when we know billionaires are financing media to do that kinds of things, and it discredits them. And so there's like this constant movement where you have to find other sources and new sources for things. Some people have really good reputations, you just see people being bought out. And I think with the way things are fragmenting now and the way that it's getting easier and easier to manipulate, for example, video and things like that, we're heading for a very complicated time in independent media, I think. I don't know what the solution for it is, because it's definitely not some other for-profit platform that, you know, is temporarily giving better access to independent media so that it can steal market and then start favoring the rich again, like all the other platforms do.
Thanks, Brian. Vijay, give us some last comments, some hope. Where around the media, around the political class, is it Latin America we need to look for? Where's the hope?
Well, you know, Pablo, the hope is everywhere. It's not just in Latin America. It's everywhere. People are struggling, you know, in this time when a UN report shows that 6 of 7 people around the planet are living in a condition of insecurity. You know, people just don't give up. They keep fighting. The problem for us as reporters is to create the means to take the people's story back to the people without having to go through money. That's been the problem for media for a long time. And I think recognizing that, diagnosing it is important. I think the future in people's media is to be rooted in people's movements. The movement itself needs to become its media. So many of our movements have neglected that. Political education has been neglected. The ability to reach your own members with the news, with stories has been neglected. You know, Brian is rooted in Brazil. In Brazil, it was so key that the landless workers movement started a media, enterprise, Brasil de Fato. So key to have the movement have a media which then, you know, is able to develop an audience in the movement. We got to go in that direction. But again, let's acknowledge the fact that we are in a real difficult situation, and let's find a way out of that from reality and not from excessive hope, in my opinion. We've got to acknowledge that we are in a real trench warfare against some vicious elements who are putting money in to destabilize and to delegitimize people who are bringing true but unwelcome news. And we have to find a way to push against them.
Thanks, Vijay, for those sober thoughts. And I think we've come to the end. We've come to the end of this session. I don't know who that was. But I'd like to reiterate and renew this call for people to, those of you in London and not in London, in the UK and elsewhere, to come to London on the 8th of October to surround Parliament to help this essential campaign to free a political prisoner, to free a journalist, Julian Assange, from the ongoing torture that him and his family are being subjected to and to do everything they can in the UK, to their MPs, elsewhere, to put the political pressure that is needed to prevent this gross injustice from being carried to its grotesque conclusion. So thank you so much, Stella, for coming and for talking to us. John, thank you for coming last minute. I really appreciate it. Brian, I know you're incredibly busy with the elections, and let's hope that we'll be celebrating the end of the Bolsonaro nightmare next Sunday in the first round with the Lula victory. And Vijay, as always, thank you for joining us and giving us your brilliant insights into politics and the media. And for TWT, for you looking and listening on the YouTube, support TWT. This festival is essential as a centre for political education, not just in Liverpool, but as this is archived in YouTube. Share this video with your friends if you liked it. Contribute to TWT, become a supporter, subscribe to their YouTube, and we'll tune in next year. And thank you for joining us.